Tom Brown here, and we are talking Elvis, as usually we do at this time. And one of those people that I'm very excited to talk to, we've been talking about different things about Elvis's career, and Peter Guralnick, author and raconteur and Elvis expert and music. I mean, you have such a love of all kinds of music. It's unfair sometimes that Elvis fans only know you from your Elvis books. But you do have a new book coming out on Sam Phillips too. So I mean, it's this love of Elvis and Memphis music. There's a lot out there that Elvis fans can discover of Peter's. One thing we can talk about today, I was looking forward to talking with you about, is Elvis and the movies. And there's been, so much discussion on, how the movies played into Elvis, mainly in the 60s, in exhausting him and in a way wearing out the welcome of some of the music and movies. And he comes back in '68 in the comeback special, and then on to Vegas in '69. But let's talk a little bit about the '50s and those four movies before the Army, and how important they were to him personally, to his career, and also just to kind of the legend of Elvis and the movies. One in color, three in black and white, which was kind of the way it was at the time. Talk to me a little bit about how important you see those four films.
Well, I think that the movies embodied Elvis's ambitions to do something way beyond the scope of what most hitmakers ever thought about. I mean, he, from the beginning, he had a vision of a life as a kid growing up in East Tupelo. He could never have filled in the details of it, and yet it was broader, it was wider, it was deeper. His ambition was to achieve the level of someone like Marlon Brando, of James Dean, of Montgomery Clift. I mean, it's not just that he articulated it. You can watch him in those movies, and you can see that the extent to which his technique, his craft developed, and the extent to which he is totally committed to the movies. I mean, it's funny, because if you watch Love Me Tender, you see this kid, he's 21 years old. He probably was never in a school play. He was so committed that before the filming ever started, he learned the entire script. He didn't realize you just learn your own lines, or that's all you need to.
Enthusiasm, it was, yeah.
And you see him, and he's just so intense and so riveted. What he hasn't mastered is the art of responding, in a sense. I mean, he delivers his lines, and it's just he's delivering his lines. But at the same time, his commitment is unwavering. By the time he made Loving You, which is kind of a fable or a myth about his own life and career, and very cleverly written, and I think very well realized. But by the time he's made that, he's made such strides. What Elvis threw himself into was a study of this, whether he knew the term or not at this point, was a study of the Stanislavski method, of being in the moment, of becoming one with your role, of substituting emotions from your own life to realize the emotions of your character. And by the time he's making Loving You, you can see him when the other characters in the movies are speaking to him. He's as involved as when he's delivering his own lines. Now, by the time he makes Jailhouse Rock, this was another kind of a thing. The choreography and again, it was playing off of the Elvis persona. Lady, I don't know what the hell you're talking about, that kind of thing. But again, he's in it, he's involved in it, and by the time of King Creole, which I think is his best performance, whether it's a movie you like best or not, he's just fully committed, and not long after that, Tom Diskin gives Elvis a book. I mean, this is about as close as you can come to his study of the Stanislavski method, but Tom Diskin gives him a book on the Stanislavski method. And I mean, Elvis, I'm sure, was as conversant with acting, like so many things in his life, and like so many people in life. Elvis was not the kind of person who liked to show his vulnerability or admit to the things that he didn't know. Colonel didn't like that either. Elvis might be willing to do that with women, but not either in a business sense or in a professional sense.
Right.
So, I mean, it's unfortunate in a way that he was never able to study acting in a formal sense. I mean, he rationalized it that this would rob him of his spontaneity, same as in music. I mean, he wanted it to be by feel. But I'm not sure that that's what would have happened, and I think it's too bad, just because it would have expanded his horizons in that respect. But if you watch those first four movies, if anybody watches them, I think you'll see a progression which is just absolutely astonishing. It's as astonishing as the progression he made in his music, and it's one in which there's no holding back. It's just a total commitment on his part.
And that's the interesting thing I've always thought about King Creole, is watching him on screen with Carolyn Jones and Vic Morrow and Walter Matthau. I mean, well-established actors, and would go on to be well-established actors, and he is holding his own. I mean, he is, and I'm wondering how
and
much...
Dean Jagger, too.
And Dean Jagger, and, that the lessons came almost... I always thought the lessons came from him studying other people and what they were doing and how they were doing it, and sharing, the screen with people like that.
I think absolutely, because Elvis was, if you said he was an astute observer, you'd be doing him a disservice. He was a most astute observer, and he picked up so many things. I mean, I forget who it was that said that they thought that Elvis learned a lot about the way that people interact in society by watching movies, that took place in milieus that he had never experienced. And I'm not sure how literally true that is, but I think given Elvis's capacity for absorbing everything that was going on around him, and for observing it closely, I mean, I'm not sure if I would say that Elvis was an especially analytic person, but he was a keenly intelligent person and an observer of somebody whose observation could have made him into a great writer, but it enabled him. He was able to absorb so much through observation and through just taking it in. He had just a remarkable mind in that way, something for which he's often not given credit, in the sense that people think of him, well, either they say on the one hand, either he's just a natural, which is the way that people refer to athletes sometimes, and I think does athletes a disservice. I mean, a great athlete, or they would say he was controlled by Sam Phillips, he was controlled by the Colonel, and I would say that Elvis, up to a point, went after exactly what he wanted to go after, and went after it in a way that was dependent upon those keen powers of observation.
Yeah. After he's out of the Army and comes back and makes almost the perfect return movie, G.I. Blues, which is, puts him back in a uniform because everybody had seen him in their mind in a uniform. But he makes two movies, and I've heard you talk about these movies. Wild in the Country and Flaming Star, I think, are two important movies that sometimes get forgotten because they're not part of the formula of movies that he did. I think it was probably 61 when he begins doing 2 to 3 movies a year until 69. Talk to me a little bit about those two films, Flaming Star and Wild in the Country. I think important movies that sometimes get forgotten.
I think they are, both Wild in the Country and Flaming Star. Again, from my perspective, which is not necessarily every viewer's perspective or yours, you don't see the same commitment on Elvis's part to the roles. These were the kinds of movies he wanted to do. I don't have any doubt that had he insisted on making at least one movie a year that was a non-musical, that Colonel would have delivered that to him. They wouldn't have made as much money. I feel like had Elvis's commitment been to explore that part of his talent, he would have done it. He could have done it. But the weird thing, and the thing that I can't explain at all, is that I feel that those two movies, as serious as they are in their themes, and as well intended as they are, do not contain performances which show the actor that Elvis was before he went into the Army. And essentially, he delivers his lines too rapidly. It's almost as if he's impatient for the actors around him to finish with their lines. He's just right there at the starting block, waiting to give his lines. And I can't really explain that. I feel as if he came back from the Army. The first sessions he had for Elvis Is Back are just astonishing in their ambition and in their breadth. I mean, probably one of his greatest recording periods of his entire career. The ballads that he recorded for the next 2 years, 60, 61, 62, these Don Robertson ballads, these Doc Thomas, Mort Schumann ballads, are just beautiful. I mean, they show Elvis as a kind of song interpreter in a manner that we don't often think of him as. Oh, and the other thing that he did in his recordings was to make his first full-scale gospel album, His Hand in Mine, which is, again, just a beautiful record. There was no absence of ambition, there was no absence of commitment, and there shouldn't have been any in the films, but for whatever reason, I don't see it. Now, the one other thing is, I think that is often forgotten is that after 62, he then plunged into these spiritual studies. He met Larry Geller, and again, people always want to see a controlling, hand. But this was what Elvis was looking for. He was looking for the, why was I put on earth? I mean, his mother's death had been a terribly traumatic event for him. And he pursued these spiritual studies for, I think, 2.5 years with an almost resolute refusal to go into the recording studio. It wasn't because, I mean, the soundtracks were neither here nor there, but the point was the ambition that he had shown for those first 3 years after the Army, first 2.5 years, it just didn't manifest itself. What he wanted was all the time he could get to read his religious books, to pursue his spiritual studies. The only way that he finally came out of that was Colonel was beside himself, his manager, Colonel Parker, because they weren't fulfilling their contractual obligations. And Colonel was about nothing else if he wasn't about you fulfill your contract, you drive the hardest bargain you can and you fulfill your obligations. But the way that he finally motivated Elvis to come back into the studio was to make another gospel album. That gospel album was How Great Thou Art. And that was really what brought him back into recording. But I think it just should not be underestimated that Elvis, it wasn't that he didn't want to make the movies he was being given. He didn't want to do anything else but pursue his spiritual studies.
He struggled with a why me? Why has this been given to me, I think, all his life?
Well, he particularly, I'd say he did from the time his mother died,
Yeah.
And it was just a terribly traumatic event, but it also threw into question Elvis's vision. Elvis's ambition was tied up in visions that he and his mother saw in the clouds. I mean, something great when he was a little kid, something great that was going to happen, something beyond the powers of the imagination, something that, and he achieved all that. He achieved it not effortlessly. He put a tremendous amount of effort to it, but nothing went wrong from the moment he made that first record, That's All Right. Nothing went wrong until, you could say, until he got drafted, which was a terribly emotional event for him. I mean, that was when he began to think, I'm going to lose everything I ever had. But when his mother died, almost, shortly thereafter, when his mother died in August of '58, well, what was it all for?
Right.
He had done all this, he had bought his parents a house, and then his mother is taken from him. And what does it mean? And what was he put on earth for? And I don't think he ever, for the next 20 years, I mean, from '58 till '77, I don't think that question ever left his mind.
No. So many things to talk about, such little time. Thank you so much, Peter.
Thank you.
And talking about the movies, my last thought is always, when I think about Elvis in the movies, for him to be on those, when he was a kid, going to those theaters in Memphis, and legend is working at one of the theaters and being thrown out for fighting. A few years later, he's on the screen fighting in his movies in those theaters he was in when he was a kid. How that must have, that sense of achievement must have been impressive not only for him but for those people around him, because he wasn't a privileged kid from Beverly Hills making movies. He was from Tupelo in Memphis and ends up in Hollywood making movies. So much to talk about. Thank you so much, Peter,
Well, thank you.
for your time.